Welcome to today's program titled Seyfarth Inclusion and Diversity Webinar Series, Creating Meaningful Change, Building Effective Inclusion Programs, Part 1. This time all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you're encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the text box on your screen. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, an attendance verification code will be read during the presentation that will be required on the CLE attendance affirmation form. Please write this code down as it will not be reread and it is required for CLE credit. Copies of this webinar recording and PowerPoint presentation will be distributed to attendees in the days following the webinar. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Lisa Damon. Lisa, you may begin.
Thanks very much, Wendy. Really appreciate it, and welcome everyone. We see people are joining as we go. Just wonderful that we've got such a good group here today. I wanted to just do a little bit of an introduction before we get into the slides themselves. This is, in fact, a part 1 of our series on inclusion and diversity. We mean this to be sort of an opening, level-setting program. We're going to lay the foundation for some of the legal issues involved in I&D programming, as well as talk about some best practices and then talk about what some of our clients are doing in an innovative way as they move forward. We will be having a couple of other sessions after this doing a deeper dive. And so Wendy mentioned to you that there was the question box. We encourage you, if there are things that you want to hear more about or more deeply, please be sure to include them in the questions, and we'll use those as we fashion the next parts of this program. So again, thanks again for joining. I wanted to take a minute and introduce the 3 speakers for today. I'm Lisa Damon. I'm a partner here at Seyfarth. I am joined by Laura Mecklin and Annette Timon, and it's truly an honor to have them with me today. We're all very involved in Seyfarth's People Analytics Group. Annette Timon is the co-lead of that group. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but it includes about 50 attorneys across the globe, as well as many other professionals who work with clients in a broad range of areas, from inclusion and diversity, hiring and testing, litigation support, pay equity, OFCCP compliance, and the like. As I said, Annette is a co-lead of this group. She's on the panel today, and she's bringing to us her expertise in inclusion and diversity. We're just delighted to have her. We also have Laura Mecklin with us today. Laura is an extraordinary resource in the area of inclusion and diversity. She's currently chair of Seyfarth's Labor and Employment Department, over 150 lawyers strong, but also she's been the co-chair of our National Inclusion and Diversity Action Team for many years, and she's a leading member of our Workplace Compliance Group. She's handled dozens of high-profile cases arising out of these issues and counsels clients regularly, as does Annette. And we are really delighted to be here today. This is a subject that we, all 3 of us, are very passionate about, and we spend a lot of our time helping our clients work through these issues. Let me just spend a quick moment on the agenda so you see that in front of you. We're going to kick it off by defining some key terms so everybody's kind of on the same page. Then we're going to do a little bit about the legal framework for inclusion programs, making sure that you understand sort of what are the guardrails in terms of the law in this area. And then for 3 and 4, we're really going to talk more about the actual structure and strategy around effective inclusion and diversity programs. As I mentioned, all 3 of us do counseling in this area, and there are a lot of lessons learned from clients who are doing this work right now. Many of you, I'm sure, come with a lot of experience as well and may have additional questions. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Laura to start us off, and please do remember, if you have any questions at all, let us know in the questions area of the screen, and we'll either answer them as we go or come to them at the end, but we'd love to hear from you. Laura?
Excellent. Yeah. So the first topic we wanted to talk about was really defining key terms. And the reason why is we're going to be throwing around some of these terms throughout this seminar and then in future seminars, and want to make sure that everyone understands what we're talking about when we use these terms. So So first, how is diversity defined? We look at the term diversity as something that's actually fairly broad. It doesn't just mean areas in which people may belong to a protected status. It's actually every attribute that makes every human being unique. So we really all are diverse when we come into the workplace. So again, it's a broad concept, and we think of it in a way of all of the ways in which humans are unique, not just their protected status. The concept of inclusion being something that is differentiated from diversity. We're not looking at the ways in which people are unique, but instead the way in which people can feel included and have a seat at the table. There's a famous quote by Vernee Myers, who does a lot of work in the diversity and inclusion context, and she says that diversity is being invited to the party, while inclusion is being asked to dance. And so really inclusion is once somebody becomes a part of your organization, they're invited to meetings, they have a place, a way to shape outcomes, and they're given opportunities in their ability to advance. We also talk a lot with corporate clients and in the I&D community about this concept of belonging, where people really feel like they are secure, supported, accepted, included. And that's a really important term or way in which we talk about the idea of really creating a culture of inclusion. And we also think about inclusion and a sense of belonging about really how do you feel when you're at work, which really gets to an underlying culture at a company. Do you feel valued? Do you feel like you should be there? Do you feel that your insights, your commentary, your perspectives matter? And so a lot of what we'll talk about is, how employers can legally pursue programs and initiatives that allow them to build that type of a culture within their environment if that's their goal. We also want to give some important framework here around global programs as compared to U.S. domestic programs. There are certainly differences in protected categories and cultural norms that play into global I&D programs, and so we'll flag that as we go forward as well. So let's turn to the legal framework of inclusion programs.
Thanks so much, Laura. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time now just doing some basic level setting, because as we think about employers who are moving forward with creating and implementing inclusion programs within the organization, having a framework, understanding of the legal ramifications that could be at play while still moving forward with your diversity and inclusion programs is really critically important. Thinking about those issues helps you to design a program that may move your agenda forward, make sure that you're creating inclusive workforces while being mindful of the law. We have seen some cases that come up, but at the end of the day, it's about understanding that and the background and the framework. So just at a very high level, we're going to focus here on U.S. law primarily. There are obviously also state issues that are implicated. What we're referring to as traditional disparate impact and disparate treatment cases. One would refer to unintentional discrimination, which is disparate impact claims, while disparate treatment cases would involve intentional decision-making based on race or gender. So when we think about that, right, disparate treatment requires intention. It's anytime you're explicitly considering race or gender or any other protected characteristic when making an employment decision. So as we get into other programs like, making selection decisions, when can you look at goals and make specific decisions, you're sort of in the disparate treatment space because you're thinking about how does this apply in that legal framework as you're building out a program. Disparate treatment also comes into mind, we think about it as being something adverse, right? So there is a particular group that has been excluded from selection decisions traditionally. But when we're thinking about inclusion and diversity programs, it can also be, not always, but can also be unlawful to think about using it in a positive way. So, we've often heard as practitioners, well, as long as I'm using it to further a goal or make a positive change in the organization, isn't that okay? There's some caveats on when that is okay and when it's not, but it's just an important consideration to have as a backdrop. And then when you have disparate impact discrimination, that's when you have policies or practices, programs that appear to be neutral across the board, apply to everybody. However, the impact that it is having or the effect that it's having on a particular protected group has a negative impact. Some easy examples that we have traditionally heard about come up in the testing context, for example. So everyone may be aware of, hey, we apply the same test to everybody, but for whatever reason, it is having an adverse impact on a particular group. That same idea or same concept also applies when we're thinking about applying programs to certain groups, and how might that have a disparate impact on a particular group that's protected under the laws. Against that backdrop are the proactive efforts that employers, many federal contractors, and other groups are looking at, because there are ways in which you can positively implement efforts to ensure that you are recruiting and employing ensuring equal opportunities across the board. So looking at goals and underutilization in certain areas is certainly permissible. So it really is a balance, and that's how we think about it. Let's move forward, understanding what the legal framework is, move forward with the goals and the initiatives, and understand where you may have pitfalls, where there might be greater areas of risk, and then as an organization thinking through how you address those to minimize the risk, but moving forward. That's where we want to get to. This idea, as Lisa started off this conversation, really making sure that we're helping employers move forward on their inclusion programs is really the goal. There are some permissible ways in which you actually can use, in the U.S., use race and gender. It is limited, but when you as an employer can identify that you have a manifest imbalance, that sounds like a very scary term, but if you can make such a showing, and here we're talking about in the litigation context, right? You're able to demonstrate that you made specific race and gender-based decisions because there was a manifest imbalance within the organization that you were trying to address. There is no precise definition of what a manifest imbalance might be. If you are a federal contractor and you use statistics and analysis to look at your workforce, there may be areas there that you can borrow from, but there must be some sort of showing of having a manifest imbalance. And even if you do, then your programs that you would be implementing can't, the legal term is unnecessarily trammel on the rights of others or act as an absolute bar. So you're not going to build a program that excludes any particular group. And then the other side to that sort of synergy that's required is also that this program is temporary and that you're looking at it and re-examining it periodically. And it's not that you're looking to maintain diversity within the organization, but that you are looking at ensuring that you don't have this manifest imbalance overall. Under the laws, the programs must be narrowly tailored so that you're really trying to solve the problem that's in front of you. It's you've got an actual imbalance that's shown, and then your programs are specifically targeted to addressing that imbalance and then moving forward. As I said, that word can be pretty scary within the organization, just to say, hey, we have a manifest imbalance across the board. So thinking about how you speak about areas of opportunity within your organizations is also an important consideration. The other area that's permissible, where there's definitely more leeway, is the implementation of policies and programs that have, it's more of a cultural bend, that are really looking at promoting respect for differences, making sure that folks are included, the areas where you're really looking at pipelines and applicant pools, and really encouraging development of certain groups that you are focused on, perhaps on bringing up through a pipeline or making sure that you are hiring a particular group. So looking at the pools, increasing the overall pools is really much more, there's much more flexibility under the law. So as you get to the actual decision making and making those decisions based on race or gender, that's where things get a little problematic. So it's good to have that as a backdrop as you move forward with developing your programs. The other thing is Laura mentioned is the global legal issues. We're not going to delve into those on this call. This may be another area that we want to pursue because it is so important. But as you're developing your programs, so many employers have just a very broad global reach. This is not an area where it's a one-size-fits-all. There are laws that are distinct in other jurisdictions, in other countries, and so you want to take that into consideration. Certainly, there are differences in protected categories and what kind of information you can collect. That's very different from what you're permitted to collect in the U.S. There are countries that, for example, forbid the collection of information about applicants' race. There might also be different protected categories, such as a caste-based system that's prohibited in India, or other just broader ways of thinking about what is a protected category. There are also situational protection issues where you're looking at reducing the reduction in force, for example, that has to do with older workers and how that plays out in different countries. There are preferences for local country nationals in some countries. So that is another consideration to think about, and think about that framework overall. Privacy and data protection regulations are also a significant consideration. Certainly, most of you are probably aware of GDPR, but that's not the only area where you've got to think about privacy issues, but how data is collected, stored, and used is very different, and that is a key component of developing a strong, cohesive inclusion program. And then we've got things like equal pay and reporting requirements that may be different across the globe. And certainly when we're looking at transparency, there are some cultures that it isn't a one-size-fits-all across the board. And thinking about what do we say when we're talking about inclusion and diversity, it's not necessarily the U.S. culture, the QS viewpoint that should necessarily apply across, and certainly the legal considerations are different as well. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Laura to talk about the risk spectrum a little bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to talk about a few of these items in a lot more detail again, actually today, later on in some different slides, but just wanted to set up a bit of a framework for how we like to think about the IND risk spectrum when you're looking at actual initiatives or programming that you might pursue within your company to drive a culture of inclusion. And so here we've built, and this isn't, this is, the way we look at it. There's more items we might be able to put on here, but it's, again, a framework for sort of thinking about the way in which there is a spectrum of risk as you tackle certain types of common inclusion and diversity programs. So as Annette covered a minute ago, the idea of simply creating an inclusive company culture generally has low risk. Of course, everything we talk about on this risk spectrum is all subject to the specifics of any given program. So the devil's really in the details. But what we're referring to here is essentially doing things like providing diversity or inclusion education for everyone in the company, having newsletters that cover IND topics, instituting leadership roles focused on inclusion, belonging, or diversity, establishing groups within a company that focus on inclusion or diversity and are inclusive to everyone who wants to participate. Those are all generally pretty low risk. Again, devil is in the details in terms of how you do them, but a lot of that is best practice in terms of what many companies are doing. We start moving down the spectrum of things that can be a bit more legally risky depending on how you do it when we start moving into leadership development and mentoring programs. So generally those types of programs are okay unless they exclude particular groups. So you get into issues of potential discrimination in those programs. But if you're driving inclusive programs that even are focused on inclusion issues, certainly having employee sponsorship programs, hypo programs, leadership, coaching programs or succession planning can all generally be done in a way that is fairly low risk. We then move to targeted recruiting and outreach, and what we mean by that is, trying to reach out to various populations that might be by one company or a particular part of a company considered diverse or underrepresented within that company. Lots of companies refer to certain populations as underrepresented employee groups. Here, a lot of times companies will simply do outreach where it's, media outlets, job boards, looking at various professional organizations, reaching out to colleges and universities that focus on, certain underrepresented populations. Again, generally fairly low risk, but if you start building in different targets or goals, that's where you might have a bit more risk and have to balance the legal framework that Annette shared. What we have also on here something that we call barriers analysis. That is generally a way in which companies look at where there may be barriers for certain underrepresented populations within their company. A lot of times we work with companies in pulling data and looking at various information about where there may be barriers to promotion, or where there may be areas in which certain populations stall out in their progression within the company. There can be litigation risk with that type of approach, and so it depends on the way in which you target the data and the way in which you, sort of approach that analysis. So you have to be careful about that. And again, we'll dive a bit more into some of those principles in a minute. But certainly here you can also look at, general satisfaction surveys, which may be discoverable later in litigation, but certainly are, perfectly fine for companies to engage in. Again, provided that you watch the details for those and making sure that the questions being asked are appropriate and the like. We move then down to both diverse slates and the numeric goals selections, both of which have to be approached carefully, but are common programs that companies are pursuing. We put them at the far end of the risk spectrum because obviously, developing programs where you are taking into account, for example, minimum number of, underrepresented categories of employees in terms of hiring pools and or interview slates can become somewhat more risky if you're actually paying attention to people's protected status categories as part of those programs. And then certainly numeric outcome goals. For example, having a goal of having a certain number of positions specifically designated for new executive female hires, for example. That's something that many companies are looking into, but again, we want to be very careful in the way in which we approach those. So let's dive into some of the key components of an inclusion program first, and then we're going to specifically talk about a few of these types of initiatives this morning. So let's go to the next slide.
Great. Thanks, Laura. We've got a number of questions that are relating to things like setting of specific goals and programmatic. Let's take those as we go, if that's okay. I think we're going to be coming up on a number of them, but it's terrific you're asking questions. Please continue to do that. That's just terrific. All right, so now we're going to ask, I'm going to ask both Annette and Laura to jump in as we go, but we're going to begin talking about the key components of an inclusion program and some best practices. Obviously, there are many, many, many best practices, but we'll highlight some that we think are particularly effective. I think one of the things you're going to hear from us over and over again is that this is very hard work. We see lots of companies with, particularly those that are facing external pressure, they're setting up diversity programs or I&D programs, but they're doing it for an external reason, and there's a lot of trappings to it and not much substance. That's a problem. You're not going to move the needle for your organizations with that kind of a program, but also, and you'll hear us talk about that, you run more legal risk, because if you talk about how important this is to you as a company, but you're actually not making a difference in people's lives in the company and your numbers are not changing, that creates risk. And so what you're going to hear from us, I think, over and over again in various ways, is you actually have to mean it. This is hard work, it's important work, it's work we all need to do, but it's hard. And so we're going to go through each of the components as we walk through this, as well as best practices. But again, please, please, please ask questions as we go. So we've got this slide in front of you just as the key components of an inclusion program. We'll dive into each one of these in different ways, but all are important. And we put this up because it actually is a good slide if you're going to take a minute, hopefully as a result of this webinar, to sit back and really examine the program you have or the one you have that you're about to launch. Really, we think that you should have each of these components as part of that inclusion program. You can't really do it well without checking off each of these boxes and really thinking about how it impacts your organization. We've got leadership and accountability at the top. It is one of the things that really drives you forward, and if you don't have it, it makes the program very difficult to pull off. And so as you're thinking about this and you're thinking about your own programs, think about how leadership shows up in your inclusion program. What's the involvement of leadership? What is their accountability? How are they measured on success? Are they a presence in terms of what you're doing? If the answer is they're not really there, leadership's not coming to events, leadership's not in charge, they're not accountable, that's going to impact the success of the program as we go. We'll talk about policies that you should look at. We're going to cover some of the workforce analytics and assessment. Talk also a little bit about cultural assessments and what role they play here. Obviously, employee development, both Laura and Annette talked to that. Communication involvement, incredibly important about how this is all communicated to your employee population and to the public generally. And then the key importance of education and training as these areas evolve, as our society evolves. Educating people, making sure people understand what's important, what people care about, is very important to the success of your program. So again, inclusion programs are not a single action item. In fact, you should be looking at this full range of components. And again, Laura and Annette, feel free to jump in at any time as we go. All right, we're going to touch on some best practices. There are a number here. As I said, this could sort of go on and on and on. But we brought a few of them out for you, and then we're going to go through some of the components specifically. So we talked about establishing senior-level diversity commitment, management, and executive participation. Again, incredibly important. If you're CEO, somebody at a very high level is responsible. It makes a huge difference, really, to everyone. So think about that. Think about how you can show it, who's in charge, how accountable they are for it. The second bullet there, enhancing inclusion programs, leveraging your compliance framework, that can be very effective. Each company has a different compliance framework, but pulling them together, making them work as in a communication way to your employees can be very helpful. We'll talk later, but things like reporting hotlines, investigative procedures, are a very important component to these kinds of programs. You want people to feel as if they have an issue, they have a concern, that there are many ways to raise that within the organization to get it addressed. Organizational policies and practices, considering I&D perspectives, we'll talk a little bit more about a list of policies for you to consider. Obviously, flexible workplace solutions, very important in the I&D context. Many employers have these in place now. Certainly COVID-19 is asking us all to re-examine this from yet another framework, but can be very important as you're moving forward. We'll talk specifically about mentoring and sponsorship programs. Laura mentioned some of the legal risk there, but these can be extremely effective. We'll talk also about 360 mentoring, which many companies are doing and can be very effective and very valuable for employees. Systemic career guidance planning programs, very important for all to have a career path, to have a way to get advice on careers. Training and education programs, we'll talk a little bit about evaluating those, again, also as we know more and more about inclusion and diversity, as society is moving forward, making sure that those programs are staying fresh and they're meaningful for your participants. You could see that even in some of the sex harassment programs that we have used for years in the compliance framework are really outdated. Maybe doing more harm than good. So we need to make sure in all areas that training and education is up to speed. And then we'll talk a lot about employee resources groups, which are an important area. We get a lot of questions on these. A great resource for your employee population, but we have some best practices for those as well. So turning briefly to leadership and accountability, we talked about that before as a very important piece of all of this. That first bullet about commitment from senior management and a framework, it is helpful to have a senior management person designated to have this responsibility. Always good if it's the CEO or someone at the top. You want people to see and to feel that kind of commitment. Whether it is a quarterly meeting that the person is attending, there are reports that are being provided, the person is involved in the effort, is a sponsor. Seeing that person, having that person being a presence to your I&D program is incredibly important. The accountability is also very important, though. So you can have somebody in a CEO or a senior leadership capacity talk about how much it means to him or her, but how are you measuring that kind of improvement moving forward? And we can talk about that later, but making sure that person is being held to some standards of accountability so that it's felt throughout the organization. One of the things we know from many surveys in the I&D space is that our employees are watching constantly. They are looking to see who's coming to meetings, who's volunteering, who's speaking up, what kinds of messages are being given both internally and externally. So it's a very important part of that. Frameworks can be different. Some organizations have diversity councils or a CDO, Chief Diversity Officer. There can be an affinity group structure. Again, we'll talk about that later. But helpful to have a framework that keeps the organization moving forward, that works on strategic plans as we go forward. And then the other thing to consider here is the role of the board of directors. This is something that a lot of companies have not yet dealt with, but can be very important. Lots of times we're seeing employees who may have I&D concerns going directly to the board, or obviously if something goes external, the board's going to be involved. So figure out a way. Is there a way to get the board involved? How are they going to exercise oversight? Clearly, it's very important that they remain within their role. The board has a very specific role. But is there a way, and is it important to them that they are exercising some oversight, that they're getting information on the program? Always be careful around legal team reviewing the board communications. You want to make sure if the CDO is communicating to the board, make sure if you're on the legal team to take a look at that. If you're somebody who is reporting into the board, is there a privilege that you need there, and is that aligned? So be careful around that, but can be very powerful, quite frankly, from an I&D perspective, to have that board report just as part of the organization itself. Let me pause for a minute. Laura, Annette, anything to add here on this slide?
I don't have anything on this slide.
Okay, good. All right, let me move on. talk a little bit about the policies. We suggest as everybody gets started or stops for a minute and evaluates programs to look at their policies. Again, if you're an employee in an organization and you're trying to understand how you are included and what that looks like and what it feels like, your policies and your training are key components of that because they're touching your employees directly. And remember that there are many policies that do in fact touch on this area. So we've listed a number of here as it says, the sort of the list goes on. But our suggestion is to take your policy manual out, take a look through it with an I and see what it is lacking, what's the wording like, what's the impact on the reader. So for instance, equal employment opportunity or your affirmative action, is it drafted so that it's tracking the law, which is fine certainly from a compliance standpoint, but is it more than that? Is it talking about the values of the company? How does the company's values around I&D come through in the policy manual itself? So take a look again with that. Very often additional language can be added that makes it much more powerful if you are an employee looking at it. Obviously, an inclusion policy, what's the framework for that? Is the framework for your inclusion program discussed in your policy manual? What does that look like? Harassment policies, compensation, very important. Obviously, equal pay is something we care a lot about from many angles, but also from an inclusion standpoint. What is the company doing in terms of that? Reasonable accommodation leave of all kinds, military leave, all of this is a package of policies to be looked at from an inclusion standpoint. You want to make sure that your policy manual is really resonating with people who may have different needs, whether they are neurodiverse needs, whether there are people with other disabilities. There are just many things to consider, but look at these policies generally and see how they are relating to people feeling included as part of what you're doing. Obviously, benefits is a big piece of this. We talked a little bit about code of conduct and complaint resolution. Again, you want to make sure from a compliance standpoint that you are providing many, many opportunities through different channels and avenues for people to raise issues, violations of your policy, bullying in the workplace, anything that's making them feel not included, making them feel as if they are apart from the organization. There's a way to raise that up, something that goes beyond what we would think of as sort of an open door policy, which is obviously still very important. And your code of conduct, I want to call that out for a second because that's a great place to make a very strong statement about what you as an organization feel about these principles of inclusion and diversity. So look at that. Lots of employees tell us that they look right away at the code of conduct or at the mission statement. Many companies had mission statements that were really focused on their customers, which is obviously terrific and essential. But many of those companies are relooking at that and including their own people in those mission statements, in those codes of conduct. So think about that. But here we're just encouraging you to look at this entire group of things as part of your I&D policy procedure. It's not just an isolated thing. It's one that really implicates your whole organizational framework. And with that, I think I'm going to give it over to Annette.
Okay, terrific. So I'm going to now dive into one of the key components that Lisa laid out at first is the workforce analytics and the assessment piece of this. This is a key component of any inclusion program and strategy in terms of how you're building out the information. But again, I just want to echo what Lisa said, is this is really hard work, even when it comes to the data and shaping the analysis and understanding what the data means and what it doesn't mean requires really thinking through some key issues. First is, what data are we collecting now? What are the data limitations that there might be, so that as you move forward with the data that you do have and the analysis that you're able to collect and understand, that you're really being mindful of where there might be data gaps in what you're trying to collect and what you're trying to measure, and then moving that forward in terms of how do we get that information down the road. Also thinking about how you're going to use the metrics to support your program needs. So one of the things we've talked about is really it's critical to use data in order to set what the programs and the policies should be for the organization. I don't think anybody on this call, and if you're doing inclusion and diversity work, you understand that it's probably not a one-size-fits-all approach. If you're really thinking about how to make an inclusive organization, it's looking at your organization, your culture, what has worked in the past, what doesn't, and then using that to support your program needs. It informs what programs you should have. Simply looking at your workforce and saying, oh, we don't have enough fill in the blank in senior management positions might tell you one piece of it, but then unpacking that using data to help understand and inform part of the question will help you develop what program you should be building or trying to target in order to move that needle going forward. And I say it brings one part of it because it tells you data, but data tells you one piece of it. It doesn't tell you the why, right? So it might give you some information, critical information that you need in order to use it forward, but trying to understand the why and then building a program to meet that need is really critical. And then the third piece of that we look at is making those fine-tuned measurements over time. So what's working as you build and create a new program? Is it moving the needle in the right direction? So it's this continuous sort of flow that's happening. There were some questions that were that came up that we've seen asking about what is the risk that we're talking about. And I think a lot of it comes up, I don't want to say all of it, but there's a lot of risk in this area. So what are you measuring? Who is measuring it? Are you protecting the data analysis portion? Underprivileged, for example, might be one way to think about it. And certainly what you're saying about the data is critical. If you have data limitations and yet you're making a sort of broad pronouncement about, a group that is sorely lacking in your organization, you might have opportunities there, but thinking about how you talk about that perceived gap is critical. What are you measuring against? Are you measuring it against your own employee workforces? What are the benchmarks that you're using? Are you basing it on census data? Is it based on a reasonable recruitment area? Are you trying to measure yourself against other competitors? You got to think about all those components about the components of the data collection and who you're going to share that information with. We often see, and we believe that data is critical to your overall analysis, but in the effort to move forward with inclusion programs, there's often statements that could come up to hurt you in litigation, whether it's about this type of case or excuse me, when I refer to this type of case, I mean like a discrimination case that's specifically attacking a diversity or inclusion program that says something like, hey, the company, in an effort to increase the representation of women, excluded me from this promotional opportunity. So that's a direct relationship. We often don't see cases like that. It often instead comes up, there might be an actual promotion claim or some sort of claim, and there's a request for all the diversity and inclusion related documents that come up. And so in that, those statements that are made about your programs and the data, even if there were limitations or not, may be used against you in litigation. So it's just really important to be mindful about how you're using the information and yet use it to drive and move forward. So when Lisa was talking about this being hard work, it is in that sense of thinking about using the data to leverage the work that you need to move forward, and yet being mindful about the risks that are associated with it. Who should have access to the data? Who should have access to the analysis? There was a question that came up about, what are the risks of using I think it was race and gender information. Well, that information is already required for U.S. employers to collect race and gender if you have more than, if you're a federal contractor with more than 50 employees, or you're a private employer with more than 100 employees, there's already a requirement to collect race and gender information. So the collection isn't necessarily the problem. It's how you're using it, and what you're saying about the data that's really critical to think about as you move forward with the program. And then using the data to identify the problem that you're trying to solve is also very important, right? So if you're saying, okay, we have an opportunity for women in leadership, there are multiple ways to attack that issue or to look at that issue. You have to first understand is, you know, do you have candidates that are applying to your organization? Are they out there and they're just not coming to your organization? Because that is sort of an outreach angle in terms of what you're trying to fix and the program that you're trying to implement in order to address that issue. If instead you do have candidates that are applying for your jobs, but they're not being interviewed and selected, those are different programs that you may want to implement. You may be wanting to look at things like training managers through the interview process. You may want to be looking at job descriptions to make sure that it's not inadvertently saying anything that might be a barrier for folks. Do you want to implement diverse slate within your program? If that's where you're seeing that enough diverse candidates aren't moving from the applicant pool to the interview stage, well, perhaps then diverse slate is an area that you do want to explore. If they are getting interviewed but they're not getting selected, then trying to do a deeper dive and understand why they didn't make it through. Are they candidates that really were very qualified for the positions, or are you moving people simply just to have the right number to meet your diverse slate requirements that you have set as an organization? How about promotions, right? So are you promoting women or whatever group that you're looking at? If you're looking at women, are you promoting them? Do you have mentorship programs and sponsorship programs if they're not getting promoted? Do you need to have some training and skills development? And that might be your area of focus instead of thinking about a diverse slate program if they are actually coming through but somehow aren't making it up the ranks. And then if you have an issue where you've got people in place but they keep leaving the organization, well, that's a whole nother way to then think about my programming needs to come at this in a very different way. And data will help you paint the picture of what's actually happening. So getting really nuanced here about the data, trying to understand it, get underneath it, and then getting to the why before you're making statements about it is really critically important as you think about it. The data will help you come up with that. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to talk about cultural assessments.
Great, thanks, Annette. We also wanted to acknowledge we're getting a lot of people who have requested that we do a second program on diverse slates, metrics, and data, and so we will definitely do that. We'll talk a little bit more about it later, but consider your multiple requests heard. Just a second on cultural assessments. They're very popular right now. You know, I think people think that this is a way to get in front of what could be a turbulent workplace environment is to do a cultural assessment. And a lot of the sort of the rules go for this that we talked about before. The one thing you don't want to do is do not do any sort of cultural assessment unless you're actually committed to change. Because partly what happens here in most cultural assessments is not only are you collecting data, which is incredibly important, as Annette has talked about, but what you're doing is you're also talking to people. So you may be doing focus groups or interviews or surveying. All of those things are very common parts of cultural assessment. So you have a workforce that feels very engaged, which is a wonderful thing. You want that. That's a great experience to have. People know you're serious. They know you're listening. But the real problem is if you get people excited that something will change and things will be different, and then you don't deliver on that, the problems can be extremely severe. And so taking on a cultural assessment is an important step. It can be a terrific thing to do, but be very careful before you get into it to make sure that you have a commitment to follow through on what you find out as part of your assessment. And we can talk more about this in other sessions, but just quickly here you'll see to engage in data analysis before engaging in the cultural assessment. That really goes back to what Annette just said, which is to understand what is the data showing you, and then from that decide how you're going to do surveys or focus groups or interviews, and then what do you do after you get the information? What's the rollout? We at Seyfarth do a number of these cultural assessments. We always have several going. Again, they can be a great tool for an organization, but you want to do them carefully. All right, I'm going to turn that over. I think, Laura, you're up next.
Yeah, so moving on to another form of initiative. We see a lot of clients, once they've looked at some of the data or they've determined they need to focus on retaining and promoting certain classifications of employees, looking to both executive mentorship and sponsorship programs. So we have just some tips here in terms of how we look at these programs, sort of arising in a couple of different categories. So first, sort of the who do you target with this type of a program. The framework and the background here in looking at who you target or who you include in these programs really arises from the EEO statutes that may apply, at least domestically, and then looking at how this might impact folks globally is certainly subject to those rules as well. So here we look at just the basic forms of discrimination. If you have this type of a program in any way it's tied to or assists with the advancement or pay of a particular group, you want to be careful. We talk a lot with these types of programs with employers about the terminology in Title VII around the privileges of employment, sort of what does a privilege of employment mean, and just making sure that you're mindful of the legal risks associated with opportunities that are essentially funneled to particular underrepresented groups vis-a-vis others. So many companies include, majority employees, folks outside of those underrepresented groups, or ensure that opportunities for mentorship or sponsorship are available to others in different ways. So a couple of these tips as well. We recommend that you consider targeting these programs to areas of underutilization and consider them for a temporary basis. That allows you to really be targeting the underutilized populations or underrepresented populations, and if you make headway there, these types of programs may not be required. Again, then we go into this area of risk associated with sort of preference for a particular group, and there we recommend that you delink those types of programs from specific employment decisions or the review process, for example, advancement opportunities and other things, so it doesn't look like it is tied directly to terms and conditions or privileges of employment. We also recommend that you consider expanding the program, like I mentioned before. So again, the details of these programs are important to unpack and make sure that the way in which you're identifying folks and then the way in which you're running the program is carefully vetted. A second way in which we see employers focusing on a culture of inclusion is looking at implicit and unconscious bias training. So I can cover this fairly quickly. It's many of you probably have seen in the I&D space that this type of training was very, very popular. It came out a number of years ago that we saw many clients rolling it out, and now we're into a phase where some of our clients and some companies have decided that unless it is a sustained form of training or communication, that sometimes it can also be ineffective. And so it's helpful to get behind, a curriculum and figure out how you might want to do this training for the highest level of efficacy. What we are concerned about a lot on the legal side is just making sure that these training programs don't suggest that employment decision-making by a company is actually affected by implicit bias. Rather, it's for education reasons and essentially educating managers and leaders to make business-related decisions that are based on individuals and facts, as well as compliance programs you might have put in place as compared to gut-based decisions that are based on intuition, which of course, if anyone has taken this form of training, you may know that gut-based decisions can lead to decisions made sort of outside of your compliance framework in certain situations. So we recommend also that you consider disclaimer language in this type of training, essentially saying that a company's educational information isn't admitting that implicit bias is present in every decision made by the company, but instead it's for purposes of education. So for employee resource groups, we just want to touch really quickly. This is another initiative that many companies have adopted. Just stay aware on these kinds of resource groups. They can, we see them a lot of times bubbling up in really a grassroots way without employment counsel or a compliance function, sort of knowing about them. There are some legal considerations here. So a couple of ideas here that you want to just stay aware of. First, you want to make sure that membership is not exclusive. You want to make sure that you're setting goals for them and they have a mission statement. You probably want to think up front what types of groups that you may allow. So we get a lot of questions about whether religious employee resource groups should be allowed, and if so, whether there should be different types of them. So do we allow a Christian group and a Jewish group and a Muslim group, or is there just a general broader group focused on religion, for example? Another big question that we get a lot is, should we allow a resource group or a community group around political affiliation? Certainly coming into November, and with Super Tuesday being yesterday, that's one that will probably arise a lot this year. You want to really set some framework for their structure and policy and procedure, how they get budget, whether time spent in these groups is compensable time, whether non-exempts can participate. You want to also have certain roles, so there are clear leaders of each of the groups who are reporting in and in some way, managed, within the company. It's also helpful to talk about how they use company logo and whether, different promotions can be done by the groups in terms of raising money, whether they can go out and use the company branding, that type of thing. This is also one where we could do a separate seminar, even shorter than an hour, about some best practices for resource groups. So again, let us know in the questions if that would be of interest to folks. So other trends. Let's go into the next section.
Okay, so we are running a bit short on time here, so I want to get through the last section. Before I do that, let me read off the CLE code. It is SS2304, that's Seyfarth Shaw, SS 2304. Wanted to make sure that everybody had that code. So a few things that we wanted to make sure we are addressing is the impact on the intergenerational workplace, and making sure that your programs are thinking about this as a sort of a, if you haven't already, a sort of a newer frontier. I was at a conference and heard current ESG Commissioner Victoria Lipnick speaking about the older workforce and the emphasis there, and making sure that as an organization you are ensuring you have age-neutral policies and processes, that you're looking at the environment to remove barriers, and thinking about how you might ensure that you are investing in skill development for this more experienced workers. Encouraging their participation is also a key component of your overall strategy. In addition, we have received a lot of questions about diverse, let me back up one second here on this intergenerational workplace issue, is looking at your job postings. I think that applies across the board, but looking at your postings to determine whether or not it's indicating sort of a preference for younger workers, that's an issue that could have, of course, have legal implications, but really it's also about building a culture of inclusion within your workforce, and making sure that you have, your experienced workforce is really valued and feels that value within the organization. We received a lot of questions about diverse slates, so we're just going to touch on this very, very quickly and briefly, because I do believe we're going to do another program on this issue. But that is, when you're thinking about diverse applicant slates, it is a very common tool that we see used. You do want to make sure that you're focusing on key positions. It's much easier to implement this instead of, across every job within the organization, but instead looking at those areas where underutilization exists. When you think about diverse slates, it's almost, as Laura mentioned, like the devil is in the details. How do you actually implement it across the organization? And if you're being strategic and applying it in those areas where you believe that you do have underutilization, it becomes a little bit more manageable. You need to have a clear definition of what's considered a diverse slate, that it is a floor and not the ceiling in terms of how many diverse applicants you should have on a panel. You don't want to create that perception that, well, I have one and that's good enough. The candidate should always meet the qualifications for the position, and all hiring decisions should be made as to each person's individual qualifications. We also see diverse interview panels that come up. That is also common. It is an area where you just want to be mindful about how you're selecting diverse panels, that you're not sort of, it's voluntary, that you're defining the structure of the panel, you're determining how they're going to make the decisions in terms of, is there going to be weighting, is there consensus decision making? And then finally, I'm going to go really quickly here on artificial intelligence. That is the other big area that we have seen that holds great promise in the diversity context. However, if it is used incorrectly, could have some really significant ramifications as well. So that is the end of our formal program, and I will turn that over at this point. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we will be sharing the slides.
Okay, everyone, this concludes today's webinar. We thank you all for attending, and have a great day.